My name is Chris Carson. I'm the Advocacy and Policy Coordinator here at the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation, and I'm so pleased to be hosting this webinar today with Dr. Douglas Kruse and Dr. Lisa Schur of Rutgers University on closing the gap. We're going to take a look at voter participation in the United States among people with disabilities and how it compares to voting participation among people without disabilities and what implications that might have for the upcoming election. And as a reminder to everyone that's signing on, or for those of you who might not be signing on, this might be more important. This webinar is going to be recorded. We are going to be posting it up on YouTube following the completion. And just a note for everyone, there's a couple of links and resources that I know I'm going to bring up, and we will be sure to include those links in the recording that goes up on YouTube and in the follow-up email that you'll get. So again, my name is Chris Carson, and I'm the Policy and Advocacy Coordinator here at the Reeve Foundation. A little bit of background on this webinar. The Reeve Foundation has just recently completed a pretty extensive voting guide that we put together looking at all 50 states, giving deadlines for voting registrations and absentee applications. And while I was putting together this blog post, I kept coming across the research of Dr. Kruse and Dr. Schur. And looking at the things that they've found about voting participation in this country, I was struck by a few things. And one of them being the size of the voting bloc in the United States of Americans with disabilities. And I was struck by how often they seem to be left out of the conversation and appeals from candidates or campaigns. And we know that this year is a very important election for many reasons. While we are getting prepared to go and vote for the presidency on November 3rd, Americans will also be casting a ballot for 35 different Senate seats, all 435 members of the House of Representatives. 11 states are going to be voting for a governor on November 3rd. And even further down ballot, 35 states are going to be voting for 82 different judgeships. So it goes without saying, it is important that organizations like the Reeve Foundation, work to ensure as much participation in the community as possible to make sure that the results of these very important elections accurately reflect the will of all of the people. So with that in mind, I'm very, very happy to have Dr. Douglas Kruse and Dr. Lisa Schur here to talk with us about some of the research that they've done on voting participation. And just by way of introduction, I will make a note here that Drs. Kruse and Dr. Schur are the co-directors of the Program for Disability Research at Rutgers University. Dr. Kruse has a PhD in economics from Harvard University. He conducts econometric studies on employee ownership, profit sharing, disability worker displacement, pensions, and wage differentials. He served as senior economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors in 2013 and 2014, and is the co-author of the book People with Disabilities, Sidelined or Mainstream. His wife and research partner, Dr. Lisa Schur, has a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, and a law degree from Northeastern. Her research is focused on disability issues in employment and labor law, particularly the Americans with Disabilities Act and its relationships to other laws and social policies. And along with Dr. Kruse, she is a co-author of the book People with Disabilities, Sidelined or Mainstreamed, and also a co-director for the Rutgers University Program for Disability Research. And I'm so pleased to have them with us all today. I'm pleased to have you all with us. And with that, I will pass it over to Dr. Kruse and Dr. Schur. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Lisa.
We're really happy to be invited to this. So thank you tremendously. We've spent a lot of time, I would say 25 years, analyzing voter turnout and other forms of political participation among people with disabilities. So what we're going to do today is just give a very quick thumbnail sketch of our main findings from several years of research. And I'm going to start, and then I'll turn it over to Doug So, first question. Oh, did you want to add something?
No, just he should flip the slide. We should tell him.
Oh.
Yeah, go ahead.
Am I good? Right slide?
Good.
You're good. You're
All
good.
right, great, thank you.
So how many eligible voters are there with disabilities? Our projections, which use census data, show that there are 38.3 million people with disabilities eligible to vote in the 2020 election. And that's based on census data. In addition to that, there are 29.4 million people who don't have disabilities themselves, but who live in a household with somebody who has a disability. So if you add those together, that's 67.7 million eligible voters, or 28% of the total electorate who either have a disability or live with someone who has one. And that's clearly enough to change election outcomes in many races. And these are based on our projections released in September of this year. Okay, so the next one. How many people with disabilities do vote? So there's bad news here. There's been a stubborn disability gap in voter turnout. People with disabilities are less likely to vote. There's this stubborn 6 to 7 point difference in general elections. The turnout, next slide. The turnout is especially low among people who have cognitive impairments or people who have disability with activities inside or outside the home. Next slide. So there are also some interesting intersectional findings here. First, looking at gender, the turnout gap between people with and without disabilities in 2016 was slightly larger among women, about 8 points, than among men, about 4 points, or 4.5 points. And what this basically reflects is the particularly high turnout among women without disabilities in 2016. And then turning to race, the disability turnout gap was actually largest among white, non-Latinos, non-Hispanics. It's about 8 points. Then among African Americans, which is about 6 points, and Hispanic Latinos, which is about 5 points. So the disability gap is smaller among people of color, but it's still sizable. And remember that turnout is substantially lower in general among African Americans and Latinx people. And the disability gap adds up, so that turnout is especially low among African Americans and Latinx with disabilities. So another very important characteristic is employment. If you look at the numbers at the bottom of the slide, there's basically no turnout gap among people with disabilities and people without disabilities who are working, who are employed. But there's a large gap among non-employed people. So in other words, people with disabilities who aren't working are much less likely to vote. It seems that employment gives an especially big boost to turnout among people with disabilities. And I want to say more about that in just a minute. But if we could go to the next slide. Do people with disabilities care less about elections? Is that why we see this turnout gap? And the answer clearly is no. There have been surveys in 2016 and 2018 that show that they're actually more likely than people without disabilities to say that they follow campaigns closely and say it really matters who wins an election. And they also are more likely to say that they're very or extremely interested in elections. So it's not a question of not caring or not following politics or elections. That's not what's going on. So if you could get the next slide. Why do we see this big gap? So it's partly explained by lower resources. People with disabilities tend to have less wealth, to be poorer, and to have lower levels of education. They're also more likely to be socially isolated, more likely to live alone. As I mentioned, less likely to be employed. Only about 1/3 of people with disabilities, severe disabilities, are working. So They're less likely to be recruited to vote. And also people with disabilities have a lower belief that the political system is responsive to people like themselves, which is interesting. And finally, voting difficulties. So if you could get to the next slide. Difficulties in voting. A study found that in 2016, 83% of polling places had one or more potential impediments to voting. And that's things like stairs in front of the door, or a garbage can that's put in a way that it blocks access to the voting booth, things like that. We also did a survey of 3,022 citizens, 2,000 of whom had disabilities in 2012. And we found that 30% of voters with disabilities said that they had had problems voting at a polling place. And that's compared to only 8% of voters without disabilities. So we get to the next slide. Some of the difficulties that people reported in voting at a polling place: reading or seeing the ballot, understanding how to vote or use the equipment, waiting in line. Long lines clearly have a disparate effect on people with a lot of disabilities. Finding or getting to the polling place, writing on the ballot, getting inside the polling place, such as steps, communicating with election officials, operating the voting machinery, or other types of difficulties. So if we could get the next one. Oh, there we go, thank you. So inaccessible polling places clearly make it more difficult to vote. And not only does that make it physically harder to vote, but it also sends the message, a psychological effect. It can have a psychological effect. It sends the message that people with disabilities are not welcome to participate in our political system, that it doesn't matter, people don't care if they do or they don't. So that can really affect how people feel about voting. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Doug now to finish this. Yeah.
Okay, great. Again, like Lisa, we're very, very happy to be here.
Yeah.
Very looking forward to questions that people may have and to hearing your ideas and
Yes.
thoughts on this disability turnout gap. People, and we're doing just a high-level overview. Want to get to your questions and discussion as soon as we can. People with disabilities can just vote by mail, right? Well, yes, and many do. 29% of those who voted by mail in 2016, compared to 20% of voters without disabilities. And voting by mail has a lot to say for it. It may especially help those with mobility problems. But even with the option of voting by mail, voter turnout is lower among people with disabilities. Also, Lisa referred to this national survey we did after the 2012 elections. We found that she mentioned that we found that 30% of people with disabilities had problems voting in a polling place. Among those who voted by mail, 13% said they had some difficulty in doing so among people with disabilities. Less than 1% of people without disabilities said that. And 11% of people with disabilities needed assistance in voting by mail, especially people with visual impairments. Next slide. So is voting by mail an acceptable alternative to making polling places accessible? Well, obviously voting by mail is going up this year. We voted by mail for the first time that I can remember.
Yeah.
And easier access may increase turnout of people with disabilities. There's some research to suggest that. But pre-COVID survey data, actually our 2012 survey, we asked at the end, but we asked both voters and non-voters, if you were to vote in the next election, how would you prefer to cast your ballot? 58% of people with disabilities said they would prefer voting in person in a polling place. That was slightly lower than people without disabilities, but it's still a clear majority said yes, they really want to vote at a polling place. And most people like the act of going to a polling place to participate in democracy with their fellow citizens, rather than just marking a ballot in isolation at home. Again, who knows what the future is going to hold here, but there is still some value, I think, to having polling places where we go vote in person. Next slide. The good news, people with disabilities do vote when motivated. We found that voter turnout surged by 8.5 points in 2018 among citizens with disabilities relative to the 2014 midterms. That was a slightly lower increase than for citizens without disabilities, but still very close. And they were an important part of the overall surge. And that increased turnout occurred across all disability types, demographic categories, gender, race, ethnicity, age group, and region. It is pretty broad based. Next slide. So, conclusions here. Bad news. People with disabilities have lower voter turnout. The good news, people with disabilities overcome the barriers to vote when motivated. And we also think participation gaps can be expected to decline over time, given trends in age, education, community integration to decrease isolation, and efforts for accessibility. There are some positive signs for the future. Next slide. Next slide, yeah. And we think, obviously, we think this is very important. We estimated from the 2016 data, and this is based on government voter turnout survey, we estimated that if the disability turnout gap were eliminated, another 2.2 million people with disabilities would have voted in 2016. 2.2 million people is a big number. It's enough to swing elections, obviously. It's also important because disability is increasing as the population ages. Disability rate will be going up. It's also interesting, almost everyone will have a disability at some point in their lives. It is generally not a fixed characteristic. People go in and out of disability status. Finally, democracy, to get kind of grand here, democracy is only meaningful if it reflects the views of all people, and everyone can participate fully in the political process. So we think it's tremendously important that everyone have equal access to voting. The next slide, what could be done to ensure higher turnout of people with disabilities? There's some best practices: increased accessibility of polling places and voting equipment, training for election officials and poll workers. There's actually a federal law that every polling place has to have an accessible voting machine, in particular for people with visual impairments, people who are blind, who can vote confidentially with an accessible voting machine. The problem is sometimes poll workers don't know how to use those machines, and that's obviously a problem. Mobile voting, sometimes voting systems are brought to rest homes, to shopping centers and so forth to make it easier to vote. Voting by mail, we referred to that, and obviously that's going up this year. Outreach and education, overcoming social isolation and the feelings that politics don't matter. This is tremendously important. That, as Lisa said, people with disabilities are more likely to be socially isolated, and that is clearly a factor, and that's demonstrable in the statistics, that the social isolation is a big factor in the lower turnout of people with disabilities. So next slides, next steps.
Yes.
These are slides that were provided by the Reeve Foundation. I think they're really valuable. The voting guide, relational organizing, remind people that the vote matters. Our health of our political system depends on involvement from everyone, as I was just saying.
Yeah, and if I could jump in here.
I'll let Chris take it over here.
Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you. No, I hope the point that Doug had made about social isolation, and I'll go back, outreach and education. These last few slides really felt like, one thing that the Reeve Foundation could contribute to this by trying to give our participants and members of our community some tools, some concrete tools that we hope you can take away from this webinar and hopefully put into use in your daily life. And we talk about relational organizing, is really just a fancy word to say talk to people, to reach out to friends and family. And here's 3 steps on how we think you can identify this. And some of these tools were taken from the NAACP and some other people working with relational organizing strategies. And you can think who, what, how. Who, Identify your network, again, is probably just a fancy way of saying who in your phone book might be looking forward to hearing from you. And I know, speaking personally, my uncle Peter out in California has just recently, his back has gotten to a point where he is now in a wheelchair permanently. And I'm thinking, in this important run up to the election, what's Peter thinking? What challenges is he going through? How can I maybe engage with him and get him thinking about what he might be doing to ensure that he can cast a vote in a safe manner in this particularly challenging time for all of us. If you're someone has a big following on social media, who's a person who is regularly engaging with your posts, who's liking your posts on Facebook, who's retweeting the things that you say, and take some time to reach out to them and start this conversation. And I particularly like this piece of advice of starting the conversation with some open-ended questions. And again, the purpose is just to get the folks that that might be living with a disability or have a family member who might be living with a disability, and particularly in our community, individuals with paralysis, reach out to them, ask them some open-ended questions. Does your county do early voting? They might say, I don't actually know. And they might go and look it up and see that in fact they do, and that they can get their paperwork in order and cast their ballot early and perhaps avoid some of these long lines. And we talk about decreasing social isolation. We've all been learning how to use Zoom and all of the technology that we have in new ways to engage with family members and loved ones. And you can certainly harness the same technology to, again, continue this conversation about engaging with the upcoming election and making a plan for voting. Depending on which social network you prefer. Some people are on Facebook, some people are on Instagram. You can do watch parties now through Facebook if you wanted to have some event watching a debate, if we have another one that is, and talk about reactions. You can set up a Zoom meeting with friends of yours and family members, and everyone can get together and be able to see one another face to face and start talking about plans for voting. I think these are really simple things that we could all do right now as soon as we get off this webinar to sort of help our neighbors and family members think about this very important topic. And just again, a couple of resources, and one more time, we're going to provide some of these links either on the YouTube page when this goes up or in our email following. But in talking to some of my colleagues here at the Reeve Foundation, there were some questions about, well, what does a person do if they go to a polling place and they're having some issues accessing the poll? And this link here from the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, we'll provide the link there. That gives some good tips. But in calling around, unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be one umbrella organization that can react to this issue in real time and help you. However, I did hear that the Department of Justice Public Integrity Division and the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division are two places where you can go and make a report if you encounter some limiting factor or disenfranchisement for whatever reason when you get to the poll on election day, if you're planning on voting in person. And then, of course, I would urge everyone, get the number for your state board of elections before you go. Call them, find out where your polling place is ahead of time. If your polling place has a phone number, and save those numbers and take some time to sort of set up that plan and reach out to whoever you think you might need to talk to on election day if you were planning on voting in person, to bring up any issues if you encounter them. So with that, it looks like we do have some questions popping up. So I will take them in the order that I can bring them up here. So Doug and Lisa, I'll read through these questions and then I'll propose them to you here.
Sure.
Okay.
So here's a note from one of our participants, Mr. Bob Kafka. Bob says, great information. Other minority groups have built a state-by-state local infrastructure to disseminate information, community organizing at the state level and local level is crucial. I'm in Texas. We are organizing under Rev Up Texas. That's revuptexas.org. We appreciate that information, Bob. And for those who are inclined, if you want to look up Rev Up Texas, I'm not familiar with them, but Bob also notes that all politics are local. So thank you, Bob. And then we had some more questions in the chat here.
If I could just add, Rev Up
Yeah.
is a national campaign coordinated by the American Association of People with Disabilities, and there are active Rev Up organizations in a number of states.
Yeah.
So I'm very glad you mentioned that.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you. So we encourage everyone to check out your local Rev Up website. And then in our chat here, we have a question from Susan Bookbinder. And Susan asks, how does someone who is totally blind vote?
Well, that's a
Yes.
good question. There's three basic ways. If you go to a polling place, then each polling place is required to have an accessible machine where people with disabilities, people who are blind, can use voice commands to vote in a confidential way. If you vote by mail, you can have someone help you. That's obviously not confidential, but you can have a family member or friend that you trust help you. The third way that is used in a few places, and I think it may be used more in the future, it's called electronic ballot delivery, where you get the ballot through the computer. You can get to your election office, you fill it out online, but then you print it out. You're not sending it back over the internet. You print it out and then put it in an envelope and then mail it. So those are the three basic ways that people who are blind can vote.
Okay. And our next question comes from Ann Atkinson. And Ann asks, to what do you attribute the surge in voting in the 2018 midterms among voters with disabilities?
Well, first of all, I think there are several issues that have become very, very salient. And one of them is healthcare and the future of the Affordable Care Act. And I think that was part of what motivated a lot of people to get out there and vote. And I know we're not supposed to get too political with this, but I think there was anger at some of what was happening with Donald Trump. And I think that caused this sort of blue wave, as they say, and people with disabilities were part of that.
It is interesting, and it's important to note that
Yeah,
people with disabilities in general, some studies have found that people with disabilities are no more or less likely to be Republican or Democrat
right.
than people without disabilities. And in fact, disability has been a very bipartisan issue over the years. Bob Dole, John McCain, presidential
Yes.
candidates were Republicans, were both had disabilities, so the disability, both Republicans and Democrats have interest in getting people with disabilities out to vote. Because their votes do go for both Republicans and Democrats, it is true,
Yeah.
as Lisa said, that there was a blue wave in general in 2018,
Right.
and people with disabilities seem to be part of that blue wave, but they could be part of any wave
That's right.
that's affecting the populace in general.
It speaks to the point of motivation. For whatever reason, maybe people were more motivated in 2018, which brings me to a question that I have for the both of you. We know that people are probably going to be motivated in 2020 as well for whatever reasons, and we know that there's a lot of barriers, a lot of challenges, and now suddenly a lot of risks associated with certain types of voting. So as you both look to the future of this research, what areas of this particular cycle are you hoping to learn a little bit more about?
Wow.
It's a great question.
It's a wonderful question. We don't have definitive answers on what's going to happen, obviously.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, we are hoping to learn a
Yeah.
lot about this. We actually, we did this survey in 2012 that was funded by the Election Assistance Commission, national survey. And I think we can say now we got funding to do another survey after, following this coming election next month, to redo this national survey. So right now we're trying to identify questions, and we're finalizing the survey now, trying to identify questions that really focus in on what kinds of problems are people going to face during the pandemic. And we really don't know. Sometimes,
Right.
reporters will ask us, do you expect disability turnout to go up or down? We're not sure. It could go up because of the increased access to mail voting.
And motivation.
And motivation, disability or employment and healthcare issues are obviously very big during the pandemic, and that particularly motivates people with disabilities. But
it
yeah.
could go down because of increased social isolation.
Yeah.
That people are more isolated now, in some ways than ever before due to COVID. And as we know, social isolation is associated with lower levels of recruitment and lower turnout. So it could go either way.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, I will also be interested to see what you find and to follow your research into the future. I will give those online one last moment, one last chance if you have a question for Dr. Kruse and Dr. Schur. If not, I will thank you both for your participation here. I think this was incredibly illuminating. And again, this webinar and the connected links to it will be both sent to all of our registrants in an email, and we will have the recording put up on YouTube as soon as possible, and we will be sure to send that out to everyone. So if there's any further points you'd like to make?
I think the only point that we would like to make is we make no secret of the fact that we are pro voting.
Yes, that's right.
We want people to get out and vote. We're not saying who to vote for. We're saying everyone as a member of our democracy should get out there and vote, and it should be easy to vote.
That's
And
right.
that's the thing that we're really pushing on, because it's been clear for a long time that people with disabilities face extra barriers in voting, and we think it should be equal access to voting, just as easy for people with disabilities to vote as people without disabilities. So we are pro voting.
Amen.
To voting. I think that's a great place to end. Thank you both for your time and your research. This was such a pleasure, and everyone stay safe and get out there and cast your vote now or on November 3rd. Thank you all.
Thanks again.
Thank you.